Out of the blue, my 20-year-old son arrived at my gate. Everything unraveled when my son was about to turn 16. He had been acting different for 2.5 to 3 years. My husband was a salesman for my father's company and often went on business trips. We had been married for 19 years, since I was 23. Peeking from a hilltop in the woods, looking at her husband working a grill in the backyard of an unfamiliar house. A woman walks out to hand him a beer and give him a quick kiss. Seeing this, she pulls out her phone and calls her husband's mother, the only person who believes her and doesn't think she's crazy. Her mother-in-law advises her to record everything and stay on the phone for evidence and safety. No sooner than she set the phone to record and placed it in her chest pocket with the camera exposed, she felt a tug on the back of her shirt. Startled, she turned to face a little girl that looked to be around 6 to 7 years old. It took her breath away. She had a stillbirth about 7 years ago and thought she could be getting emotional because of that trauma. But there was something about this little girl that seemed so familiar, connected. The little girl said, "I know you. You're Auntie Sarah. I've seen your picture in Dad's phone. Come on. They'll be surprised to see you." My brain was malfunctioning, but I heard my mother-in-law through the earbud in my ear. "Breathe, Sarah. Stay focused. You wanted answers, and now's the time to get them. Stay calm, keep recording, and go on down with his daughter and get some answers. I can see and hear everything, and I have your back." True. I've been made to feel like I'm losing my mind for far too long. Since right before I got pregnant with my little girl 8 years ago. I question everything, my husband's actions, trips, and our finances. The money didn't match the time he claimed to be working. My parents used to be supportive, but as of late, glossed over everything. Then for the last 2.5 to 3 years, my son changed drastically. His attitude, his sudden desire to be with his dad without me, camping trips, boys trips, etc., and being distant toward me. Sometimes almost sad and other times angry. Yes, it's time for some answers, I stated more so to myself, as I approached the backyard with the little girl whom I've learned is named Lily. Ironically, the same name I'd chosen for my little girl. I heard my mother-in-law gasp upon hearing her name. Suddenly a sight caused me to stop our approach abruptly. My son, John, came out the house and sat at the picnic table near his dad and the woman. I can't hear their conversation, but he is definitely familiar and comfortable in that surrounding. That's my older brother, John. Sometimes he's nice to me, but that's usually when no one else is around. But when everyone else is around, he treats me like the rest of them, like they don't want me around, Lily said dejected. Hearing that broke my heart, and I had to kneel and give her a hug. "Well, let's see what we can do about that," I replied with a compassionate smile. Mother-in-law in my ear exclaims, "Oh, I'm going live with this. You just keep going and stay strong. It's time for some answers and expose this." I agree. After a deep breath, we stepped through the tree line and into the openness of the backyard. You could see the color drain from my husband and John's faces. At the same time, a look of satisfaction or smugness aimed at me from the woman turned to a look of irritation or disgust toward Lily. An excited Lily shouts, "Look at who I found, Daddy. It's Auntie Sarah." I follow her lead. "Yes, James. It's Auntie Sarah." Surprised. My husband, stumbling over his words, "Sarah, this is a surprise. What are you doing here?" "Oh, I always wondered where you and John were running off to and decided to surprise you." "Who would have imagined all this?" I dramatized. Turning to the woman, "You look familiar, like I know you from somewhere." A victorious look with some evil villainous expression appeared on her face when a scantily dressed teenage girl came out of the house absently speaking, "Mom, have you seen that brat? I need her to clean." Her voice trailed off as she took in the scene outside. Then like her mother, a smug, villainous type expression appeared on her face, and she sauntered over and sat on my son John's lap. She planted an exaggerated kiss on him, clearly a show for me. Yet, it achieved the desired effect on my 15, nearly 16-year-old son. Clearly, I am Auntie Sarah. So, does that mean that I am your sister, James? So, would this be your wife and daughter and son? Inside, I was a total mess. Only having Pauline in my ear was keeping me sane enough and strong enough to keep going. "Sarah," James starts before being cut off by the viper next to him. "Oh, grow some balls. We knew this could and probably would happen someday. Yes, you have met me before, some 8-ish years ago. Yes, I am the only semblance of a wife that he has. Yes, this is my daughter and of course, you know John here. I see you met Lily in the woods back there. Figures you two would meet in some creep fashion." I hear Pauline in my ear, "Stay strong, dear. Don't let her shake you right now." We have over 200 people watching this live right now. Expose them for all the years of torment. You can do this. Seems you also have a girlfriend, John. Is this a case of like father, like son, I ask? John simply looks down, but the raunchy girl on his lap is more than happy to respond. Well, I can't say I'm his girlfriend because of the family dynamic and all. So, I guess you could label me more of a partner or mentor or teacher. Tilting my head to the side, you have a way with words, Tamika, she proudly gives her name. Yes, Tamika. How old are you? I inquire. I'm 19 and in the prime of my life. Unlike you, old hag, is the venom she spits. 19, you say? Since you have this family dynamic, as you say, then I guess you know that John is only 15? Yes, I interrogate. And your point is? Lil John has become Big John the last couple of years now. Bigger every year, groping him. She licks up the side of his neck, making him flush a bright red. Geez, Mom, some daughter you're raising there. Looking at the state of your joggers, James, you seem to enjoy seeing your son being taken advantage of. Disgusting, I rage. He immediately tried to cover himself with a towel, before the viper next to him added to the mess. Oh, don't be coy. She came all this way to learn about what father and son have been up to. She gave a cue to her daughter and simultaneously tongued the man next to them before switching partners and repeating the action. I thought I was going to be sick and could literally hear Pauline gagging through the earbud. By the time the vipers finished, both males looked stupefied. Someone is trying to beep in, but I can't entertain a phone call right now. I need Pauline's support and to gather as much evidence as possible. I turn to Lily. Do you have some dolls you can play with inside? You are too young for this type of nonsense. Seeing that she's hesitant to leave my side, I promise I won't leave without saying goodbye. Okay, she replied shyly before heading inside. The most heinous laugh comes from Viper number 2. Like mother, like daughter. You're both pathetic. Seeing the look of confusion on my face, she continued. Just look at the little freak. Can't you see the resemblance? Oh, that's right. You believe you had a stillbirth. Ha ha ha. Too good. First, your husband, then your newborn daughter, and then your son. You should just give up already. Your parents have. Can't you see that all you have left is that small piece of ignorance? And that's fading fast. So what will you do? Cry? Have a mental breakdown? Call the police? Oh, I have a suggestion. Why don't you just die already? The medication they've been drugging you with is expensive. We knew we couldn't keep this secret for much longer. Your parents even. They desperately need the money, so just die. My parents? James' phone and John's phone are ringing persistently, but neither is moving to even look at them. I can't tell what they're thinking, as my mind is working overtime trying to connect all the dots. My parents constantly brushing off my concerns and constantly asking about my health. John's distance and attitude, with the sudden desire for solo trips with his dad. James traveling, money not equaling all the so-called extra hours at work, his attitude of not wanting to be around me, and sudden desire to cook when home, etc. Suddenly, Derek pulls up and comes running into the backyard. He whispers something to James and the Viper. Their faces go ashen. The Viper comes storming my way. I smirk, waiting for her to get a little closer. Then I pepper sprayed that bitch in both eyes and her mouth. Down she goes in agonizing pain. Viper number 2 follows suit, and in repetitive fashion. Down she goes in agonizing pain. Now we hear sirens approaching, and it sounds like a lot of them. Derek is panicking. Man, I cannot be here. If it comes out that I had any parts of this or the past. As he's trying to flee the scene, a call comes over his radio for all to hear. You might as well stay put, officer. Didn't you just inform them that this was being live-streamed? Stay put as we have arrived and have questions for you as well. The message becomes a double echo from hearing the man speak while approaching and over the radio at the same time. The captain stops beside me. Not to worry. We also have a car going to pick up your parents. He turns to the pale-faced foursome. So, let me go over my notes. So far, we have admission of assault, kidnapping, attempted murder, mental and emotional abuse, parental alienation, fraud, and a slew of other charges that we haven't begun to break down yet. Will require further investigation into the hospital where your daughter was born, but it seems that your child did not die, but is that little girl in there. We'll continue all of this down at the station. Book him, all of them except Sarah here and the little girl in the house. I ran into the house shouting for Lily. She came out of her hiding place, and all I could do was open my arms with tears streaming down my face. She ran to me, and I'll never let her go. Pauline met me at the station to continue as my support. Hugging me, It's time for both of us to lose some dead weight. It was revealed that my husband, James, met the Viper, whose name turned out to be Crystal, during a doctor's visit when I learned I was pregnant with Lily. They began an affair, and he started missing work, and my parents' company started losing business. My parents approached James about the issue, and evidently Crystal found the quick solution of a new client for their company to look the other way. The new client for them plus my difficult pregnancy pushed them to agree. Knowing the client was going to cut dealings in short order, James and Crystal came up with the plan to take Lily and blackmail my parents. Their ultimate goal was to have me committed, then divorce me and take everything, if I didn't die, so they could receive the insurance money. It almost worked. John found out about his father's affair when he was 12. At first, he was angry with his father, like I'd never seen before, but he wouldn't open up to me. Then they started going out and became closer and closer. Eventually, I became the bad guy in every scenario, always overthinking or nagging, told I was losing my mind after losing our daughter. I couldn't do anything right. Even my parents were on their side. The only person that supported me was Pauline, and she had to do that discreetly. James had friends, lots of them, cop friends, gym friends, school buddies, etc. He was a salesman. Crystal was my prenatal nurse. I ended up having an emergency C-section with my daughter. The hospital records showed that I was administered a higher dose of anesthesia and that I delivered a healthy baby girl. However, Crystal switched the name tag of my daughter with an unfortunate stillborn and fled with my child. They were going to start a new family without me, but with my children. My parents were stuck in their web from accepting the client from Crystal to cover James' mistakes and grievances. How could they ever tell Sarah that they knew and went along with it? Now Crystal's client was gone, and the business was suffering again. James did whatever he pleased, holding their actions against them. In their desperation and Crystal's instigation, they planned to drug Sarah over time, so that her death would not call suspicion. Her parents took out a huge insurance policy on her, as did James. Over time, Pauline noticed the changes in Sarah and began paying closer attention. She noticed her son's comings and goings, his attitude, his wanting to cook all of a sudden, his spending and change in clothing. She noticed her grandson evolve from super sweet and athletic, to angry and despondent, to anxious and temperamental. Mostly she noticed how Sarah was becoming weaker and frilier, how she seemed isolated and disparaged. Everyone was telling her that Sarah was losing her mind, but she held lucid conversations with her. It was then that Pauline advised her to look into things and maybe even set up a hidden camera. Sarah fought against such notions for over a year, before finally admitting to herself that something was wrong. She'll never forget the first time she saw James crushing up the medicine and putting it in her food. She never ate anything he made her afterwards. It's not as if he stuck around to watch her eat it. That gave her time to clear her system and further investigate. Unknowing of her parents' role and initially confiding in them, she hit a lot of roadblocks. James had time and insider information of what changes he needed to make to stay undetected, like turning off his location and getting a burner phone so messages and calls wouldn't be on the phone bill. He had friends that worked at the hotel they used before he got her the house, at the restaurants they went to, on the police force monitoring for him, and of course, Crystal in my doctor's office. So, when John found out and I wasn't succumbing to being poisoned fast enough, they instated her daughter abusing my preteen son. It was revealed that as soon as she turned 18, they would swap between my husband and son, their own little swingers paradise. Lily started showing more and more characteristics, mannerisms, and features to me as she grew. This was unacceptable to the Vipers, a mixture of emotions for my son at times, and nothing but repellent to my husband. She was in her own right, a Cinderella. Since everything was live-streamed, there was nothing any of James' connections could do for him. He was avoided like the bubonic plague. I sued the hospital and police, winning several $1 million. I disowned my parents and son. My parents were arrested for insurance fraud. My son was arrested for conspiracy to commit murder as a juvenile. The Vipers were both arrested for kidnapping, assault, and child abuse. Crystal, of course, had a plethora of additional charges from the hospital. However, neither of them survived a week inside once the other inmates learned of the livestream and their charges. As for James, let's just say we are officially divorced, and he will never eat solid foods or walk unassisted again. Did you all know that they have access to the internet and social media in prison? James was a celebrity right off the bus. So, now looking at the young man on the monitor at my gate, I face a conundrum. My daughter, now a preteen herself, comes to stand at my side. I remember he was nice to me sometimes, but he never did anything to help me either. So maybe we can be nice to him sometimes. You have grown up so much, with such a beautiful heart after everything you've been through. You're right. We can be nice to him sometime, but it will not be in our home. Actions have consequences, I replied. Lily and I were leaving for a planned trip the next day, and while at the airport, I received a security alert that an intruder had been arrested for breaking into my house. It was John. He had trashed everything and put the pictures of Lily and I in the fireplace. He was stopped before starting the fire. So, I informed Lily that it may be a while before we can be nice to John, but we can try to get him some help. Right now, he's not safe to be around. She nodded and replied, okay, with a slight tremor, remembering how he was when mad. Let's get him some help. I called the psychiatrist that Lily and I saw and prepaid for sessions for John. She would go see him while he served his time for the breaking and entering and attempted arson. After hanging up, I looked at Lily. Done. Enough of that. Let's enjoy our vacation. I made a mental note to get in touch with Pauline later to see if she could take care of the state of my house while we were away in exchange for a spa retreat. We arrived at our destination and got settled. We decided to do some sightseeing before dinner. Let's go ride the Ferris wheel on the boardwalk, I suggested to Lily, who agrees, and off down the beach we go. A big shout out for Jane Norwood. This is her first story submission. She is an upcoming author, so please support her work. Please share your thoughts in the comments section and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Wednesday, Doug. The doorbell ringing at 9:45 that Wednesday evening initiated the unraveling of my wife's deception, although she did not realize it yet. I answered the door to find myself facing a man and a woman dressed in reasonably normal business attire, although the clothing was somewhat out of style and obviously well-worn. I immediately got the idea that these two were with the police, not so much from their appearances, but from the fact that this was the week that Frank and I had agreed upon to execute our campaign of payback. "Good evening, sir," said the woman. "Are you Mr. Douglas Franklin?" "Yeah, I am Doug Franklin. May I ask who you are and what this visit to my house at this time of evening, unannounced as well, I might add, is all about?" I had to play the ignorant fool, even though I had a good idea what was coming next. "Who is it, honey?" came the voice of Joyce, my wife, the lying, deceitful. Well, anyway, she had been really nervous all evening. More about her later. She was wiping her hands on a kitchen towel as she came into the front room, into which the front doorway opened. "I don't know yet, sweetheart," I said, trying to keep the sarcasm out of my voice. As she came up beside me, she had a frown on her face. "Are you Mrs. Joyce Franklin?" asked the woman at the door, shifting her attention from me to my wife. The man with her still had not said anything and looked bored, if anything, with the whole situation. "Look," I said, trying to feign annoyance and cover my inner glee at what I suspected this was about. "You have been asking questions here on my front porch and have yet to tell me just who you are and what this is about." With a resigned sigh, the woman withdrew her hand from her shoulder bag, and the man behind her pulled his hand out of the inside pocket of his sport jacket. When they both flipped their hands in what appeared to be a synchronized and practiced manner, 2 police badges caught the illumination of the front porch light fixture. I heard Joyce, my wife, groan to herself as the woman said, "I am Detective Sergeant O'Neill and this is Detective Scurry, and we are investigating an assault that occurred earlier today. And we would like to ask you and Mrs. Franklin some questions." I had practiced my put-on expression of surprise a couple of times over the past few days in front of the mirror, and now was the opportunity to see if it went over without arousing any suspicions. What assault? And why would you believe that my wife or I would know anything about such a thing? I said with rising irritation, also well practiced in my expression and voice. I glanced around to look at Joyce and saw that her face had lost all color and that she wore an expression of stark terror. She was looking away from all of us and appeared to be about to hyperventilate. The male detective spoke up at this point. "The assault took place early this afternoon, resulting in severe trauma to the victim." In one of his few lucid moments before he went in for surgery, he identified Joyce Franklin as the primary witness to what happened to him. This has also been corroborated by several other witnesses at the scene of the event in question. Still pretending ignorance and surprise, I said, "Who was this victim? I mean, my wife, the primary witness, what?" At this, I paused just as an honestly startled husband should pause, and continued to play the role of the ignorant fool, as part of the scene that was now bringing my wife's little secret world down around her ears. "Mrs. Franklin, what is nature of your relationship with a Mr. William Gerardo, and what were you and he doing together when he was assaulted in the back parking lot of the Newton Motel on King Street this afternoon?" asked the Detective Sergeant O'Neill. Well, that was blatant. She was obviously going for shock and awe. There was, out in the open. No getting away from it now. Joyce let out an anguished sob, and it appeared as if she were going to pass out. I just turned my head slowly back toward my wife and looked at her with an expression of curiosity and surprise. At least I hope I did okay with those looks. That slowly turned to alarm and then anger, as she began to bawl openly and back away slowly from me. Friday. Frank. Fridays are usually a bit less hectic than the other work days in the week, so I was not particularly busy that day in the middle of the afternoon when my secretary, Jan, told me that I had a call on line 1. Frank Simmons, I said. Mr. Simmons, this is Deputy Gibson, with the Cherokee County Sheriff's Office. Could I schedule a few moments of your time this afternoon or evening? Said the husky voice on the other end of the call. Deputy Gibson, I don't understand. Just what is the nature of your request? I asked, already realizing that Doug must have held up his end of the bargain already if I was getting a call like this one. I'd rather wait and tell you in person, Mr. Simmons. Could I drop by your residence later to speak to you this afternoon or evening? Also, it might be best if Mrs. Simmons is available for this as well. In fact, she really needs to be there for this meeting, he said somewhat evasively. I was glad that he could not see the smile of satisfaction on my face as I said, well, I must say that I am confused, but curious. Of course, you may come by. Is 7 o'clock okay? My wife, Sybil, works during the day, but she is usually at home in the late afternoon and evening. We both should be home by the time you get there. 7 p.m. it is, Mr. Simmons. See you then. And then the connection was broken. I hung up the phone, swung my chair around, stood up, and took a deep, satisfying breath as I gazed out the window of my office. Tonight, bitch. It all comes out in the open tonight, I thought. Then I realized that I would have to play out my part completely. I would have to call home to alert Sybil to the coming visit of a sheriff's deputy, or else she might suspect, rightly, that I was setting her up. The home phone rang 4 times and went to voicemail. This was strange. Sybil was supposed to be home by this time of the afternoon. Maybe she was simply in the bathroom. I called again 5 minutes later and got the same result. I waited 10 more minutes and then I left a message telling her that I would be home at about 6:15 and told her about the call from Deputy Gibson and my lack of knowledge about anything concerning the pending visit. As I hung up, I grinned to myself as I thought about how, so like an unsuspecting husband I had sounded as I had left that message with just the right amount of concern in my voice. Back to Wednesday. Doug. I had allowed the fury that had built up within me to be let out in the form of ranting and yelling at my cowering and crying bride. To ensure that I did nothing more than scream, I made sure to vent my feelings to the fullest, all while Detectives O'Neill and Scurry were still around to serve as protectors of Joyce and witnesses to my restraint in not getting physical with her. After I had finished my histrionics and had visibly calmed down, and after giving the detectives all the answers that I could provide, I had left the front room and gone upstairs. There, since I had already pretty well decided what I was planning to pack to take with me, the hasty packing of clothes and toiletries was easy. Then I had to make a great show of leaving. It did not take long before I was stomping down the stairs dramatically with my suitcase in hand and my backpack with my laptop computer and some documents I would need for a few days. Joyce was still caterwauling on the sofa in the front room. As the story had come out, with the help of the 2 detectives, it would seem that my wife had been to the Newton Motel twice in her life. On both occasions, she had been there to have sex with one Bill Gerardo. The end of the second visit had been rather more eventful than she had ever imagined or expected. It would seem that, after Gerardo and she had left the motel room today and had split up to go to their separate cars, a hooded man had appeared from behind a van parked next to Gerardo's Lexus, surprising Gerardo when he was turned toward his car. The unidentified man had carried a baseball bat in one hand and had not appeared to care that Joyce saw him. For the next few minutes, the hooded man had beaten Gerardo severely, badly bruising his ribs, breaking his left arm and right leg, and paying special attention to Gerardo's groin area once the victim was on the ground. Following the beating, strangely, the assailant had not attempted to rob Gerardo. He had simply looked up at Joyce with the bat propped on his shoulder and had shaken his head at her. Joyce, for her part, had remained frozen in place and speechless with terror. After the hooded man had turned and run to the lot of the adjacent convenience store and had disappeared behind it, several people had begun to notice the wounded Gerardo, and 1 or 2 had come over to help. 2 others had simply stood back and taken cell phone pictures and video. People had finally noticed Joyce standing there, recognizing that she had been there with Gerardo, and several phones had captured her image. According to witnesses, she had finally broken free of the grip of her terror and had turned in panic to get into her Corolla. It had taken quite a bit of frantically trying to get the key in the lock before she was able to get the door unlocked and open, and then to scramble in and get the car started. Once the engine had finally turned over, she had sped away from the lot, with one or two people's phones capturing images of her car, including her license plate. It seems that, according to Detectives O'Neill and Scully, Mr. Gerardo had drifted in and out of consciousness on his way to the hospital in the ambulance and had said the words, Joyce and Amy, alternately. He had been awake only once in the regional hospital's ER long enough to answer a couple of questions for police and mention Joyce Franklin's name before he was being wheeled into surgery. So, Mrs. Franklin, once again, I need to ask, what was the nature of your meeting with Mr. Gerardo? Detective O'Neill had asked with an expressionless look at my wife. She had swallowed and had looked at me with the saddest expression I had ever seen her wear. She had then whispered, Doug, I am so sorry. Then she had looked away and begun crying again. Only when I had begun yelling at her, asking what the hell this had all been about, had she finally relented and admitted that she had been at the hotel with Gerardo for sex. But I had been too incensed to listen to her when she had tried to say, but it is not what you think. Yeah, I had thought. Right out of the Infidelity Manual of Instructions, under things to say when you get caught cheating, that was when I had begun to put on my show of going upstairs to pack and leave. I was remembering all this as I drove away from our home of the previous 4 years, 1 year of living together followed by 3 years of supposedly happy marriage, after only about a half hour following the arrival of the two detectives. Now, I was headed to my already arranged hotel room for a week's stay. Regardless of how things turned out when all this was over, I needed to be away from the house right now in order to keep alive the subterfuge. I also had to prepare myself psychologically to carry through on my part of the agreement with Frank. I had to get my game face on. Forward to Friday again. Frank. When I got home Friday afternoon, after having received the call from Deputy Gibson, I discovered several not really surprising or unexpected things. First, Sybil, my wife of 8 years, was not there. Her car was not there either. After I had dropped my gym bag and had stopped in the kitchen to grab a Yingling out of the fridge, I had looked at the wall phone in the kitchen and had seen the blinking light, no doubt indicating my voicemail message from earlier. Passing through the den, I got the impression that something was slightly out of kilter, but I was still too jacked up with anger to dwell on it. I climbed the stairs to our bedroom and sat down on the bed to take off my shoes. I stripped off my shirt and tossed it toward the hamper, missing it, of course. I took down my pants and, when I went to hang them up in the closet, I noticed that Sybil's clothes were gone. I sighed and turned back to the bedroom. Looking in her dresser, I saw that all her underwear and stuff was gone too. When I got back downstairs after dressing in some slacks and a polo shirt, along with my moccasins and no socks, I then realized why the den had been different. Several knickknacks, pictures, and other items of Sybil's were missing. Oh well, good riddance, I guess. I should have been sad. After all, we had spent a quarter of our lives together, but I was still just too pissed at the time. And after all, I still had a part to play in front of Deputy Gibson when he got here in a little while. Mr. Simmons, Deputy Gibson asked, when did you find out about your wife's affair with Mr. Philip Avery? My wife's what affair? Avery? I put on the well-practiced, confused, and surprised look. You mean, my wife is cheating on me? Who? Then I gave a visible deep inhalation of breath, closed my eyes for a second, and did my best to appear to be trying to remain calm, although I was laughing my butt off inside. Finally, before you said anything just now, Deputy, I had no idea that my wife was having an affair. Then I opened my eyes and looked at him, after having rubbed my eyes with the forefinger and thumb of my right hand. The forefinger and thumb that I had coated in Tabasco sauce right before the deputy had rung my doorbell. My eyes were now visibly red and tears were forming when I addressed him. I guessed that her lover. Is this? What did you say his name was? Avery? He nodded slightly. I whispered as I sat down heavily, no, I had no idea. May I speak to Mrs. Simmons, sir? Gibson asked. Maybe she can shed some light on our investigation. Is she here? We will need her statement as well. I shook my head and tried to appear dazed. When I got home, she was gone, along with all her things. I guess she has left me. That's all I can make of this. Now is the time to switch gears emotionally. If I were to carry this off for the benefit of the deputy, it was time for the aggrieved husband to strike out in righteous anger. Just when did the sheriff's office begin investigating the dalliances of 304 wives who screw themselves out while their beloved and trusting fools of husbands work to provide for them? I stood and began to pace and wave my arms to add to the dramatic look of things. Then I paused to give the deputy my best snarling look. He was obviously a veteran of many of these types of situations, as he was not fazed a bit. In fact, he looked slightly bored by the whole thing. Mr. Simmons, we do not investigate cases of adultery, or dalliances, as you call them. But we do investigate matters when those dalliances may be the instigating cause behind felony aggravated assault and battery, and possibly attempted murder, he said without raising his voice one bit. But he was watching me closely as he said all this. Once again, I put on the surprised look. To quote Captain Renault from the movie Casablanca, silently in my head, I'm shocked. Shocked to find that gambling is going on in here. Deputy, I am shocked. Absolutely shocked to find out that my wife has been cheating on me. But do you really think that she hurt her lover? Tried to kill him? I asked, knowing how ridiculous it sounded. Deputy Gibson almost smiled as he drawled out, "No, I don't think that she did anything like that. What I am trying to find out is just who else might have had a motive to do something like that. For instance," here he looked piercingly at me, "the aggrieved husband, maybe? Okay, it's Oscar time." Deputy, I assure you, I had no idea that this affair was going on, and I certainly am not a violent man. And just when did this assault supposedly take place, if I may ask? Deputy Gibson paused for about 10 seconds, obviously gauging my response and thinking about just how much to tell me as he assessed my possible guilt in this matter. It took place at a motel parking lot out on Lone Tree Road at about 8:30 yesterday evening. It seems that the motel has a bar attached to it, and the victim, Mr. Philip Avery, was a regular there, often meeting with Mr. Simmons, I am sad to report. Deputy Gibson really did not look sad at all about telling me this. Then he continued. He had only had 2 drinks yesterday evening, in the company of your wife, I might add. They both seemed agitated, according to the bartender. They finished their drinks, and then he walked out to his car in the parking lot just a few minutes after she had left on her own. An eyewitness in the parking lot says that a man wearing a black ski mask and wielding what looked like a baseball bat assaulted Mr. Avery by striking him high in the back. Then, once the victim was on the ground, the masked man proceeded to beat Mr. Avery all over his body. He avoided the head, but seemed to take particular delight in striking Mr. Avery's testicles. Here the deputy paused and seemed to wait for me to show some sign of emotion, maybe shock, outrage, or guilt. It's been our experience, Mr. Simmons, Gibson continued again, that this type of attack and the physical targeting of the beating is indicative of a cucked husband taking his revenge on his wife's lover. I couldn't help myself. I actually flinched at the word cuck. But other than that, I was able to maintain my expression, combining innocence and incredulity at my circumstances. Deputy, I finally said, I am still trying to process all of this, so forgive me if I sound strained right now. I mean, what with my wife leaving me and finding out? I let my voice trail off. Nodding in feigned sympathy, the deputy gave me a look that hinted at the idea of, go on, and? Obviously looking to see if I would rise to the bait and maybe confess to something. I can assure you that I had no connection to the incident you have described last night, I said with a sigh, other than the connection that you have alleged about my wife's knowledge and relationship with this guy, Avery. But last night, I was in my office with my office manager, Janet Barkley, finalizing our business tax filing documents until almost 10 p.m. Just contact her, and she can verify my whereabouts during the time frame that you describe. Deputy Gibson simply nodded and said, yeah, I already talked to her just after you left your office this afternoon and before coming over here. She already provided you with your alibi. Now, I had to show anger in order not to give away anything else. What do you mean? You already talked to her. Then, what was all this about asking me all of these questions and hinting that maybe I was involved? Hey, Mr. Simmons, Gibson said, now stepping back and leaning back a bit to give himself some room to react if I got violent with him. We have to check out everything in these cases. And you have to understand that, based on many past cases of this type, the aggrieved husband is usually the primary suspect until something else comes up. And now, I presume, something else has come up? I mean, now that you know where I was during this assault? I asked, still showing anger, but demonstrating restraint as well. Let's just say that we now need to pursue other avenues of investigation and leave it at that for now, he said. Still trying to rattle me. Well, I had to do the indignant bit now. If you have anything more to suspect me of, and you wish to ask me anything, you can do so through my lawyer. Calm down, Mr. Simmons, Gibson said, with the upraised hands, trying to pretend that he meant to ease my hurt feelings with his gesture, and still not raising his voice. I don't think it will come to that. By the way, if Mrs. Simmons does contact you, I would ask that you tell her to contact the Cherokee County Sheriff's Office, and I would ask you to let me know too about any contact with her. At this, he handed me his card. Anyway, that's all I needed tonight. I truly am sorry about the situation with you and your wife, and the way you had to find out and all. I'll be going now." With that, he put his Stetson on and walked to the door. As I was about to close the door on him, he turned around toward me and said, "Remember now, if y'all hear from Mrs. Simmons, we really would like to talk to her." I just nodded, and he turned to go. I closed the door behind him and breathed out slowly. This time, I went back into the dining room and pulled down the wild turkey instead of going into the kitchen after a beer. Taking my first sip, I silently toasted Doug and smiled. The boy had come through for me, just as I had for him. Thinking of my now-departed bitch of a wife, I said aloud, "Sayonara, bitch." The next Wednesday, Frank. The swimsuit issue of Sports Illustrated did not seem to be a magazine that fit in with the tone that a divorce lawyer's office might seem to want to set. But hey, I'm a guy, and I like to look. So I was thumbing through it as I sat and awaited the start of my appointment. I had checked in with the receptionist at the domestic law office of Chantal Hawk, a divorce attorney well known for her ruthless pursuit of the well-being of her client. Word was out that she especially hated cheating wives, and the message had spread loud and clear about her among the aggrieved married male population here in Woodstock and all around Cherokee County. Other attorneys, some judges, and even a few law enforcement types quaked in their boots when she was around. Or, sometimes, just when her name came up in conversation. It was now Wednesday of the week following the violent events that had surrounded the affair of my wife, and since she had pulled her disappearing act from my life, I had called to make this appointment and gotten it confirmed for today. Following that call, and after getting my confirmation that my initial deposit to her account via my credit card had cleared, Ms. Hawk had emailed me with a list of steps that I needed to take immediately to protect my assets and myself. If you have read any of the cheat stories on the internet, then you know about closing any joint accounts, canceling credit cards, dividing savings and checking accounts, changing insurance and retirement account beneficiaries, all the hateful and financially devastating things that must be done during the lead up to a divorce. During all of this, I had also called Doug. He needed to know about my appointment, specifically the timing. I had deliberately arrived about half an hour early for the appointment so that we could do our own little dance of deception. As I thumbed through the magazine, looking at the babes in their swimsuits, I became aware of another person entering the office and approaching the receptionist. "Excuse me, but I may be in need of a good divorce lawyer," said a male voice. One that I knew already, but I had to pretend that I did not. I had to force myself not to look around. "Of course, sir," answered the receptionist. "And just how did you hear about Ms. Hawk?" And on the questions went. She was doing her bit to verify the effectiveness of Chantal Hawk's marketing and advertising scheme while she began to gather the prospective client's initial information. After about 3 or 4 minutes of this, the receptionist told the guy, "If you would just fill out these forms for us, we can see about getting you an appointment with Ms. Hawk. She's booked up today and tomorrow, unfortunately, but we shall see what we can do about getting you in to see her on Friday." With obvious sadness and hesitation in his voice, the guy said, "Oh, okay." Pause. Do you have a restroom I might use?" "Sure," she said to him. "It's in the main hallway of this office complex. Out the door and then to your left." That was my cue. I gave the guy about a 20-second head start before putting my magazine down and standing. I smiled to the receptionist and told her, "I need to hit the gents before I go in. Please tell Ms. Hawk that I am still here." "Sure thing," she said, smiling at me as I turned to go out to the main hallway. In the men's room, I saw him finishing his business at the urinal. I checked the only stall in this small men's room to ensure that we were the only two there, while he washed up at the sink. I turned back toward him as he dried his hands and asked him, "You okay?" Doug turned to me and gave me a strained smile. "Yeah," he said. It's still. I never knew that I had that much rage in me till now. I have never harmed another human being the way that I did last week." He had been looking away slightly as he had said this. Now he looked at me directly and said, "It kinda scares me." "You know?" I nodded and said, "Yeah, I know. Look, I had to ensure that he was on track here. We now have a legitimate reason for knowing one another. I mean meeting at a divorce lawyer's office. Can you keep this up as we go back inside there?" Doug nodded and said, Yeah, I can." Then he blew out a puff of air to signify that he was trying to keep calm. I grinned at him to reassure him. "Look, Doug, your situation is different from mine, and we both know it. Just remember, when you get to that third page of the questions on those forms, you know how I told you, where they ask about counseling and the possibility of reconciliation, then you?" 6 months later. Doug. I am not usually a bar fly, but this night was the 6-month anniversary of the venture that Frank and I had begun our adventure together as a way to satisfy our mutual rage and get our balls back. When Frank had shown up at my workplace that first time and introduced himself to me, I had been fat, dumb, and happy, living the life of a carefree man with a good job and a beautiful and loving wife. Life couldn't have been better, or so I thought. Frank had asked me to meet him after I got off from work, as he had some information that I needed to know. When I frowned at his evasiveness, he had said he would buy me drinks and dinner if I would simply listen to what he had to say. I hesitated, but, hey, free drinks and dinner don't come my way very often. And this might have been a new customer, although eccentric, maybe seeking my business. So, I had agreed. That evening, my bright, happy world was no longer bright. Nor was I happy after he finished with his tale. He drugged her, Doug. You have to remember that, and keep that foremost in your mind. She did not set out to cheat on you, Frank insisted. He had shown me pictures and transcripts that his PI had given him in a report of the investigation of Frank's cheating wife, Sybil. I had not been aware, up to that point, that my wife, Joyce, actually worked with Sybil, or that they had become more than simply passing acquaintances. Joyce had actually begun to go to lunch with the slightly older Sybil. It also appeared that on those days in recent weeks when Joyce had begun to stop for drinks and time to wind down on the way home from work, she had been doing so in the company of Sybil as well. Evidently, Frank's PI's surveillance of Sybil and the subsequent electronic eavesdropping that went along with that had resulted in information relating to Joyce at that point. Joyce, it seemed, was shocked when Sybil had begun to let slip hints about the older woman's running around on her husband, Frank. While shocked, Joyce has still been somewhat excited and intrigued by all of this, but only from the point of view of someone who had been reading romance novels since her teens. I knew now that Joyce had seen all of this as excitingly naughty on Sybil's part, but Joyce would not have actually indulged in any extramarital behavior on her own. Still, she could enjoy hearing about Sybil's exploits and promising to keep them just among us girls. The two women had been stopping for drinks for about 2 weeks together when, one afternoon, two men came over to their table and asked to join them. Joyce had been about to refuse, when Sybil had simply scooted over and told the two men that certainly they could join them. Joyce had been noticeably upset, according to the PI's report, but Sybil had been visibly enjoying herself. Joyce had left shortly thereafter, but the report went on to say that Sybil had adjourned to a room in the motel building adjacent to the bar with both men. They had remained there for approximately 2 hours. The following week, Joyce and Sybil were once again at the same bar after work. The same two men, now identified in the report as Bill Gerardo and Phil Avery, had come into the bar a few minutes later. They had once again asked to join the women and Sybil once again had acquiesced. The report documented that Joyce and Sybil had left the table for a few minutes to go to the ladies' room. During that interval, one of the men, Bill Gerardo, had removed what looked like a small vial from somewhere in his clothing and had poured its liquid contents into Joyce's drink, stirring it with his finger. He had then said something to Avery, and they had high-fived and smiled as the ladies had returned. About 20 minutes later, after having finished her drink and reaching for her purse, Joyce had appeared to be slightly uncoordinated in her movements. Sybil had sought to ascertain her welfare, getting a confused look and response from Joyce. The two men had offered to help get Joyce to a place where she could lie down and recover before attempting to drive anywhere. The PI's report indicated that, unsurprisingly, the men had just happened to have a motel room available next door. Yeah, I know he drugged her the first time. Gerardo, I said. It was her letting him blackmail her into coming back a second time, without being drugged, that pissed me off. But what really gave me a case was the fact that she did not trust me enough to tell me about what was going on and let me help her out of the mess she had gotten into with that shitbird. I had to take a sip of my drink to calm down. I'm her husband, for God's sake. She is supposed to trust me enough to let me defend her, to take care of her. What kind of a man does that make me if I can't protect my own wife? If she doesn't even trust me enough to let me? We remained quiet for a moment as we each looked at our drinks on the bar before us. So, you and Joyce still working things out? Despite all of that? Frank asked me. He was nursing wild turkey meat, while I was enjoying an arrogant prick ale. Yeah, I'm still pissed at her a little bit though, I said as I took another pull on the larger-than-usual bottle, but I'll get over it soon. I got her into assault trauma counseling right after things came out in the open, and the outfit that handles her counseling also does couples marriage counseling, so we have been doing that as well for the past 10 weeks. Doug, you know that Sybil was deep into it with those two jokers. She probably was the one who had suggested using date assault drugs on your wife, Frank said to me, still trying to offer support. Yeah, I know. We went over that together months ago. By the way, did you ever hear from Sybil? I asked. Nah, Frank responded, and then took another sip. It's as if she has vanished from the face of the earth. But when her money runs out, I expect I will hear from her. Or maybe from a lawyer acting on her behalf. Meanwhile, I still have that divorce paperwork that I started with Chantal Hawk. Chantal says that I can modify the grounds for a divorce from adultery to irreconcilable differences, or even to abandonment if the bitch stays out of touch for long enough. No skin off my nose either way. Frank was obviously still carrying a lot of anger around with him. Frank would never admit, and I wasn't going to be the one to tell him, that he could only be that angry if he still carried around some quantity of love for his ex, despite her cheating ways. Yeah, I had picked up a couple of tidbits of knowledge about that kind of thing during the counseling sessions. Well, I said with a grin, at least you got the formal separation paperwork in, so that you are legally free to lower your white count if you need to without getting a countersuit for adultery. Frank grinned back at me and lifted his glass in my direction. You got that right. Then he took another sip and looked off into space for a couple of seconds. Let me ask you, Frank went on, are you and Joyce finally back to doing, the deed? I smiled and simply nodded. I was not going to go into details about our sex life. After all this had come out in the open, it had taken a couple of months before we had finally gotten together for sex after all of that, and only after she had been in counseling for a while. But man, the changes. It was as if Joyce could not do enough for me in her guilt-ridden efforts to make things up to me. Sex anyways I like, and I had finally gotten her number. It turns out that the son of a bitch, Gerardo, had been the first one to the summit to speak on that one, but I was taking advantage of it now. I just had to make sure that I did not overdo it. Movement behind us, along with a clearing of a throat, made us turn away from the bar together. A woman stood there in a very sexy dark green cocktail dress. It showed off quite a bit of her ample cleavage and revealed quite a bit of thigh due to the slit up one side. Frank and I both were speechless as we gazed at this vision of, what is that British term? Oh yeah, sex on legs. So, she said, you two do know each other, it seems. Something clicked, a stirring of recognition. Then it hit me. Sergeant O'Neill, as I live and breathe. Wow, I never suspected that a policewoman would look as nice as you do off duty. I was trying to keep my tongue from doing two things, letting it run away with itself and give away what Frank and I had done together, or hang out in an obvious display of lust at this vision standing before us. Actually, it's Lieutenant O'Neill now, but that is just the name I go by professionally. When I am out with my husband, I am simply Mrs. Gibson, she said, just as a well-built and well-dressed man stepped over to join her. I did not recognize him, but I detected that Frank suddenly stiffened. Hello, Mr. Simmons, the man said. I see my wife introduced herself to you. Then he looked at me and stuck out his hand. Jeff Gibson, was all he said as I took his hand and shook. He had a purposeful, but not overly aggressive grip. Frank cleared his throat and said, Doug, this is the Deputy Sheriff Gibson I was telling you about who investigated the case involving my soon-to-be ex-wife back a few months ago. I raised my eyebrows and did not say anything to that. And I investigated the case involving Mr. Franklin and his wife for the Woodstock PD right about the same time, said Lieutenant O'Neill. Well, Mrs. Deputy Gibson, I guess. She looked slightly amused as her gaze went to Frank's face and back to mine. I was working very hard to keep my expression neutral. Doug and I met at the office of my divorce lawyer, Frank interjected. Since we discovered that our wives knew each other and had been, involved with the men involved in those incidents that happened at that time, we stayed in touch. Now, we meet once in a while to share the misery, so to speak. Except, I took up the case, trying not to let this drag out. Frank's wife simply ran off and disappeared. My wife and I are trying to patch things up and move on. Lieutenant O'Neill smiled thinly at me and said, Well, Mr. Franklin, I am glad to hear that you and the missus are trying to fix things. By the way, we still have an open case file on the attack on Mr. Gerardo. She paused to see if I would respond. When I simply grimaced and took a pull from my beer bottle, she went on. He is still in rehabilitation for his leg, but it appears that he will have a limp for the rest of his life. His arm is doing well, though. It is a good thing he is right-handed. I did not really give a shit about the recovery, or lack thereof, of Bill Gerardo, but I simply nodded. His wife, Amy, divorced him and took their 2 kids, along with a huge chunk of his finances. It also seems that his reproductive organs, while still functional, are somewhat lacking in potency at this point. It looks like the low motility rate of any sperm that his body generates will make it difficult for him to have any more children, should he decide to remarry. She seemed to carry an air of satisfaction about that herself. I guess even cops, if they are female, want to see slug-butt cheating men get their due. Yeah, piped up Deputy Gibson. And, Frank, if you ever have any contact with your ex, let her know that we still have the case open concerning the attack on Mr. Avery. His injuries were not quite as extensive or severe as those to Mr. Gerardo, but he still had quite a lot of medical expenses. These hit right about the time that his wife, Wendy, hit him with divorce papers as well. Frank grunted and said, couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. Both Deputy Gibson and his wife alternated looking at each of us as the silence grew, but neither said anything. They simply sported amused expressions. Finally, well, y'all have a nice night now. You hear? Said Deputy Gibson as he took his wife's hand and led her out the front door. Frank and I turned back to the bar and drank in silence for a few minutes before he looked around and spoke softly to me. You did make sure to get rid of that bat, didn't you? Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. I could see that she was angry. The look on her face was clearly anger with the capital A. I could also see something else in her eyes too. That look that I had felt myself once before, not so long ago if I didn't miss my guess. Of course, I was in bed with her best friend, and we were both naked, having just had one great round of sex. Her friend was actually better at screwing than Betty was. I hadn't been surprised about that. Shauna had that going for her, and I suppose that is what made her such a great lay. Shauna is a blonde, shapely sex goddess, kinda along the lines of Miss Monroe of the 50s and 60s. You know, sex, all sex, oozing sex, bursting through with sexuality and expressing it in such a, well, sexy way. She knew what she had and she used it, often. I didn't have to work too hard to get Shauna in bed either. Matter of fact, once she realized that I was coming on to her, it took, maybe 10 seconds for her to go into bitch mode. Even though I was fairly certain of what to expect, I was surprised at how quickly she took the bait, considering that I was married to her best friend and all. Betty stood there in the doorway of our bedroom, shocked at first. Then I saw the red anger clouding up in her cheeks. Then I saw a flickering of that something I knew was the pain of discovery. I knew that I had gotten the message across at that point. Betty turned and walked out. We heard the front door slam. I had a couple of things in my mind at that moment. First, the fact that Betty had said nothing, just stood there glaring. The second was Shauna who, much to my surprise, started to work on me some more. She had seen Betty standing there and just went back down on me, working me back up, as if her being naked in bed with me was no big deal at all. Oh baby, now that I've had you, I need you again. You know, you really surprised me when you started to come on to me earlier, but I'm glad that you did. I've wanted to screw you ever since Betty married you. You are one hot hunk of man. You're not upset that Betty knows about this? Oh baby, she'll come around. If she doesn't, so much the better, 'cause you'll be a free agent, and I'd do anything to hook up with you for a while. I can't understand why you changed your mind like you did, but I am sure glad you did. I was uncomfortable, even though I knew my reason for being naked in bed. Sweaty having screwed a hot and wanton woman was just you ask? Let me explain. We have been married for a few years, and the edge of the newness of all that had worn off. I guess we had hit the 7-year itch, you could say. I hadn't, until that day 8 weeks ago. 2 months, just 2 short months ago. I came home early from work, unexpectedly, and when I walked into the house I was about to shout out I was home. Before I did, I noticed the clothes leading to our bedroom door. Man's slacks, woman's skirt. Man's shirt, woman's blouse. They shouted at me to keep quiet. So I was. Looking in the bedroom door, I was stunned at finding my wife, Betty, naked on top of some guy that I didn't know. And they were screwing. I could see that it wasn't their first time that day. They were engrossed with each other and didn't hear or see or even sense me. Although I think Betty may have had a premonition since she froze for a second, just as I started to turn to leave. I stopped and held still, then she shook herself a bit and went right back to work. I stood away in the hall listening to them until they finished up. I heard them talking, and from that talk I learned that this was not the first time, nor would it be the last. From what I gathered, this had been going on for quite some time. They made plans for their next tryst, and then I heard them laughing and playing around as they headed into the master bathroom to clean up and probably have some more sex in the process. I went out to my car, after having checked the wallet in the pants of the a-hole ID just caught my wife with. Name and address and some other information, like the picture of the wife and 3 kids, credit card numbers, and a bit more. I drove away, and since I had 2 hours to kill before I was expected home, I drove to a nearby park and thought out what I was going to do. Never having been in such a situation before, at first I had wanted to go kill 2 people, But then I realized that would only serve to put me in jail and never have any peace. I wondered why, of course, since I had thought that Betty loved and respected me. She always told me she loved me every morning as I headed out to work, so I didn't have any reason to not believe her, until now. Knowing that my marriage was about to end, I decided that a little revenge would serve them both right. I also knew that I'd never be able to do much to hurt Betty, at least not quite like she had just hurt me, but even though I still loved her, I knew I'd never be able to live with her after this. Their words burned in my mind. "So did you ever expect us to be so good together, Betty?" "Oh no, Sam. You're so perfect. I mean that too. Everything about you is perfect. I wish I had met you before. I really do. We could have had a great time all these years." "Yeah, well, I was married right out of high school, and then started working for the wife's old man, so that would never have happened. But I am like you. I wish we'd met a long time ago. You're a right fine babe. You know that I love Jim, but he doesn't do it for me like you do. I just hope we never get caught. Jim would probably try to hurt you, and fail of course, but then I'd have to explain everything, and that would be a large pain. After all, I don't love you anyway. I love screwing you." Their words were indelibly etched into my heart. How long had they been doing this? I didn't know, but I knew it had been too long already. He was bigger than I was in height and build, but I think that Betty would have been shocked and more than a little surprised to find out that he would have been the one hurting. I had been in the service, and she knew that, but she didn't know about my boxing days. I kept that from most people since I had hurt Billy so bad that day. He was still messed up in the head from it, and I just wanted to forget all about what I had done to him in that ring. I had been young and feeling tough, as had Billy. We had an exhibition match, and during that match he had been talking to me between punches. His banter had gotten to me, and my eyes saw red at one point. He had been teasing me about my then girlfriend, and how he'd have her that night after he got done beating me to a pulp. It had been that friendly banter used to irritate a buddy. He'd not been serious. In the heat of the moment, I had missed that though. He never stood a chance, and I started to beat him senseless. Before the ref could get in, I had hit him 8 times hard in the head because my first punch caused his hands to drop away. I think he had been going down on my first hit, but I never gave him the chance. After the fight, he'd been taken to the hospital, out cold, and they were unable to bring him out of it. He'd been in the coma for a week. He never recovered to be quite the same man. He quit boxing, and it was as if he had lost some part of him. They had to reteach him how to talk and do the basics of living all over again. I had taken away Billy and left a 5-year-old child in a grown man's body. I quit fighting after that, and I also put some money into his bank account time to time to help take care of him. His parents thought I was a hell of a nice man. I didn't. I felt like a shit. Hence, I didn't talk about that time with anyone. I carried that around with me all this time, knowing that with my hands I was dangerous. I was far more dangerous than the average person and definitely not one to screw with. Now, I sat there in the park wanting to hurt 2 people, but knowing that I could never go there without screwing up my entire life. So I came up with an alternative plan, one that was twisted, but just as twisted as what Betty and Sam had done to me. I set out to plan what I'd do, and today was part of the culmination of my revenge. I can't say I am proud of it all, but I do feel somewhat vindicated. I wouldn't sleep well for some time to come at any rate, but I would be sleeping a bit better. At least I thought so. Shauna left about an hour after Betty caught us together. Shauna kept telling me that I was pretty well hung too. I supposed after seeing Sam, I was better hung than he was, which was part of why I didn't understand Betty's words about how nicely he is on bed. Later that evening, Betty came to the house with her sister in tow, and they gathered up her things. I never said a word, and Betty acted like I should have been begging for forgiveness. I didn't, and I think that hurt her worse than I could have by finding her and Sam together. Her sister hung around for a bit when Betty took the last of her stuff to the pickup. Why? Why would you do that to Betty? How could you do that with Shauna of all people? I don't understand you at all anymore, Jim. Try asking Betty about Sam. Then come back and ask me that again. That is if Betty tells you the truth about Sam. Call it what you want. I feel quite good how things have turned out. I hope that Betty understands what this means. What are you talking about? Ask Betty. You're her sister Susan, but you don't know her very well. I found out about her 2 months ago, and I have had one hell of a time keeping control. You just ask Betty all about Sam, then remind her that it takes 2 to tango, and once one starts that tango, not to expect the other partner in the marriage to not do something about it. You're saying that Betty cheated on you? Bullshit. I have it on tape, several of them as a matter of fact, Sue. I also have them in my mind from the first time I saw them. Yes, Betty cheated on me. She started this mess, and now I am finishing it up. She can have her lover, and I hope they choke on each other. After they left, I made the call I had been dreading. The beans were spilt though, and I had to get in touch with Sam's wife before he could put any spin control on what was about to become public knowledge. After having seen them together that day, I had figured out a plan of action. Part of that plan had been to get even and let Betty catch me doing so. I wanted her to feel that intense pain of discovery, how I'd felt, or at least I hoped she would feel that pain. After all, I had felt that pain not so long back now, and it still was a raw, festering wound in my heart. Part had been to tape the two lovers together, which hadn't been too hard. They met 3 times a week, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, just after lunch, and they always did it in our bedroom. How long exactly I wasn't sure, but it had been going on long enough to let me know that our whole marriage was a sham now. I just set up a camcorder and a timer and caught them all on digital. Each time I downloaded it to my computer, I felt sick. It took all I had to go undercover like I did, mainly because I was constantly fighting the urge to kill and maim. Both of them. I had also moved money around, investments, and other financial items had been addressed as well. After my call to Sam's wife with the promise of copies of what I had on film, I made another call to my bank. I found out that Betty had just learned about the changes, and she had laid into the poor girl there like a tornado. I felt bad that innocent people had to be a part of such a bad scene, but I really didn't have a way to insulate some parts of my plan, moving as fast as I had. I was alone for the rest of the week, and actually didn't mind it too much considering what had transpired. Susan called me one day and made me make a date to talk to her. I was reluctant to do so because I thought that she'd be trying to push Betty back into my life, and I didn't nor couldn't allow that. I loved her still, but that would go away eventually, and what Betty had done to our marriage was too much for this man to take. I didn't know how it happened, and I didn't care either. That Betty had done it was more than enough. My revenge had been harsh, but nothing what her sister put her through after the truth all came out. So, Betty turned out to be a stupid bitch. I am sorry, Jim. Well, I never expected to hear that from you, Susan. Hey, she had the best man in the whole world, and screwed it all up by having that tawdry affair like she did. I hope you never take her back, that's for sure. It would serve her right. Then your hopes will happen, because I've filed. I also gave copies of everything I had to her lover's wife, so I imagine that he'll be suffering right now too. Shauna? Why her of all people anyway? You only did it with her in order to get caught by Betty. I know I asked Shauna about it, and she was quite forward in telling the tale, so to speak. But why did you choose her? She was amenable to my plan, and she lives close by. Matter of fact, once she understood why I was doing what I was doing, she was insistent that she be the one to be with me when Betty caught me cheating. I always thought they were friends. Yeah, me too. Guess not though. You know, maybe Betty is as superficial as Shauna is, and I just never noticed it. Shauna told me that she had always wanted me, so it was so much better knowing that beforehand. Remind me to never cross you, Jim. By the way, why? My only other alternative was to do bodily harm to them both. I've been there before. Never want to go there again. It still haunts me. What? Been there before? Haunts you? Never mind. Water long since under the bridge, and I won't talk about it now. My thoughts were on that ring that day so long ago. I wish I could have seen the look on her face when she caught you too. I'll be she was furious. Why? Why what, Jim? Why are you being so damn nice all of the sudden? And why aren't you taking up for your sister? She is family after all, Sue. First of all, I was always jealous of Betty when she met you, Jim. I always had a crush on you. Always. Secondly, she had, as I said, the best man in the world, yet she couldn't be happy with just you. I can't understand what she was thinking at all. Yeah, well, that's something I can't understand either, but for very different reasons than yours, I suspect. You could have left her some cash, you know. Mom and Dad were furious with you until I found out what she had been doing with Sam, and once I told them, well, things changed rather quick. Dad wanted to kick her out immediately, but Mom managed to stop that, barely. I thought for a bit that Dad was going to kick Mom out with her. It was a close thing. Whoa. You know that Mom and Dad had a similar thing in their early days, right? Nope. Oh yeah. Dad caught Mom screwing around on him, and he went berserk on them. Daddy beat her lover to a bloody pulp, almost killing him. He kicked Mom out for a while, but eventually he took her back. I guess quite a few people were amazed that their marriage managed to survive it. The other couple didn't though. They were divorced rather quickly. Wow, I never knew that. I guess Daddy was thinking like mother like daughter. He was even a bit pissy with me for a while too. He got over it though. It's a wonder that Betty didn't think of that before she strayed. We talked some more, but I wanted to finish up and get back home. Since Betty wasn't there, I had been left with the house cleaning. Things that I had taken for granted. When I had been so happily married, that is. Susan, though, wanted to talk. It took me a while, But I finally realized that she was trying to work a way to come on to me. I shut her down as soon as I knew that. Susan, why are you talking to me like I am something more to you suddenly? Look, Jim, just because Betty decided to throw away your marriage doesn't mean that I don't find you attractive and someone I'd like to get to know better. Oh, well, honestly, Sue, I am not interested in starting anything right now. My fling with Shauna was to show Betty what it felt like to have a spouse cheat on you with someone. I'll admit it had a bit of spice, but I found out that I couldn't screw around anymore. At least not until all this shit with Betty is settled and done with. I am not built that way. You'll give me a chance? I don't know, Sue. I honestly don't know. Maybe, but don't hold your breath. I may end up moving somewhere else. This whole thing has messed up my mind pretty bad. She left, a little wiser and a little sadder, I think. She is a nice-looking lady and any man would be lucky to have her. But I had an issue in that her sister was too close to home, so to speak. I had been married to her sister until all this crap happened. Now I wanted distance from my soon-to-be ex-wife. My life went fairly smoothly for a while after the shit settled down. It took 4 long months, but eventually the courts and the judge arrived at a just decision, and we were granted a divorce. Actually, I was granted the divorce, as Betty at first refused to allow it, then tried to turn it around on me, then finally tired to hit me for more financial comfort. Ours was a typical semi-bad divorce, but I held on and my lawyer ended up being a good investment. Now I was officially alone and single. I took the alone part to heart hard though. I had a difficult time sleeping. I was miserable when at home, and I soon learned that I had to get rid of the damned house in order to try to find peace of mind. In the divorce, I ended up with the house, and so I put it on the market. I had tried for months to work out living there, but that damn place held way too many memories, now mostly the bad ones, so I realized that it had to go. I found out several things in the process. During the divorce, for whatever reason, the lawyers had used the original appraisal instead of having a new one done. Partially due to the fact that at the time the appraisal was to be done, Betty was certain that I'd come around and take her back, so she had told her lawyer to use the appraisal we already had, as it was only 3 years old. Due to that, when the realtor came up with a new value, I found myself suddenly sitting on a house worth half again as much as I thought it was worth. The other thing was that my house was in a hot spot and desired by almost everyone who knew about it being on the market. By the time the realtor had the house listed, there were people lining up to look at it. When it finally sold, 6 couples were bidding on it, and it was all-out war between them to get my house. I ended up accepting an offer that was above the accessed value by a large margin. Moving to a new job across the country, I was soon in a comfortable, albeit lonely existence. New digs, new people, and new job. All stressful and at the same time, relaxing too. I never thought about Betty too much, although I did think about Sue once in a while. There had been something there. I knew it. But what it could have turned into, I didn't know. Let's hear the perspective of Betty. Here I am, newly divorced and alone. So terribly alone. My lover of the last years has dumped me like the plague, and trying to keep from ending up divorced just like me. Once I knew that I had been caught, I had severed all ties to Sam. Too little, too late. In effect, we both dropped each other, but in both cases, well, I had thought that I could turn things around and end up back at home with my husband. And in that, I also found out that the man I had married did indeed have a strong backbone, and he withstood all my grandstanding. Looking back, I can clearly see that I really messed up. I had the perfect husband, one that almost any woman could and would kill to have, and I had tossed him out into the world of available women all so I could have a little excitement on the side. That was Sam all over, by the way. He was excitement for me. When we did it, I had that naughty feeling of pulling something over on Jim. Had I been thinking right, I would have never done that. I got bored, then acted out in a way that was self-destructive. Self-destructive as a drug habit, or becoming an alcoholic, or any number of other things people will do to themselves. If I had a chance to do it all over again, never in a billion years would I have cheated on Jim. Had I realized how hurt and angry I would have made him, I'd have cut my wrists before cheating on him. Hindsight. You know what they say about that, 20/20 and all that. I've been a terrible, stupid fool. I spent several weeks thinking about what I had done and how I had ended up like I did. I can't put my finger on when I exactly decided that it would be okay to sleep around on Jim like I did. I can't tell you why I would do something so dumb. I can't even claim a blonde moment since I am a redhead. I wish that I could take it all back. Now I am alone and having to figure out what my next step in life will be. I am young enough to start over, but I really don't want to do that. I want Jim back and I want my life back. The life I had before I slept around on Jim and ruined his respect for me. Was it worth it? Hell no. In no way is what I am going through worth all the supposed fun I was having. I sometimes think that knowing what I did, no man will ever have me as wife material again. They may jump my bones, but the good wife part of my life is probably over with forever. I screwed that up, and it's public knowledge that I didn't have my priorities in life right. I don't have any answers for you about why I did what I did. I know that I hurt badly now, that I sleep alone every night, that I hurt my husband, the man that I do. I really do love the most in my life, beyond any hope of recovery, like water under the bridge. I can never return to that life except in my memories. I've already turned down several dates and coffee offers from men who would like to get to know me. I want nothing to do with any man, with one lone exception, and I drove him away from me. You'd think that a smart woman like me could differentiate between being a good wife and being a cheap 304. No, before you say it, I never slept with anyone else but Sam and Jim. Never was tempted. Sam and I met under weird circumstances, and we started up after having known each other for several years. It just, well, believe it or not, it just happened. Neither of us planned to fall into bed, yet once we did, it became like a drug. Our meets were filled with the hints of danger and the excitement of the illicit sex we had. Each time seemed better than the one before, right up until I was hit with the knowledge that Jim had found me out. Then a black hole spread out around me and engulfed me, sucking me into the depths of that light less dark that nothing escapes. My sex drive, that once had been quite hot, well, now it's cold as ice. I haven't had an urge for sex ever since Jim found me out. Well, that's not true. I have wanted one man. That one man I chased away. My sister won't be around me much at all anymore. My mom and dad are furious with me. Daddy won't even talk to me yet. The worst thing is my sister. I could see her working on Jim, trying to capture him in her grip. She would be a better woman for him. I'll admit that. Susan has always been the type of woman that will keep her man interested in her and too busy with her for either of them to stray. She is also a one relationship at a time type of woman too. Even way back when in high school, she'd break it off with one boy for a long while before she'd take up with another. I always never understood her that way, but now I can see that I was blind even back then to being the right kind of woman for a man. Don't get me wrong, I love my sister, and if she did catch Jim, I'd be happy for her. Yes, happy. Even while I would be in deep pain at losing my husband to her. Someone that I had all to myself, and I failed him totally. I am not the happy person I once was. I am not the cheat I once was either. I learned my lesson. But in my case, that lesson was taught too late for me, and that final grade, well, it came at the highest price. I don't think I'll ever want another man again. I can't have the one I had, and I lost him because of another man. I am done. Jim sold our house, our home. I know that's my fault too, but still it hurts because he's moved across the country and away from me. I am sure he will find someone else, and that hurts too because I know how kind, good and wonderful a man he is that I let slip away. That's not right that I drove away. That's it. I drove him away. I knew that for certain when he dropped the check off from the proceeds of the house sale. My share, that is. He didn't have to, but he took the difference of the original appraisal and what he sold it for and gave me half. Even though I had cheated on him as I had. I held out my hand so he could lay that check there, and as he did, the look in his eyes was enough that I just wanted to drop into the nearest hole in the ground and never come out. Where there had once been love and that certain indefinable lust, there was just cold, dark, and anger. Where his eyes had before always been flashing deep blue, they were now a light ice blue with little needles of pain. Sam and I had been having our affair for just over 2 years when we were found out. What started it all, as I remember, was we had a barbecue one weekend evening, and Sam, being the new guy at work, had been drugged along with a few others. Jim had been called away just before Sam showed up, and I had taken over the cooking. We had people from where I worked and from where Jim worked there that night, and as things dwindled down, Sam, me, and a young couple were left. The young couple finally left, leaving just Sam and I. I had been drawn to him during the night even more than I had from work. He was one of my departmental co-workers, and his ability to make me laugh had started a fire deep inside. By the time everyone was gone, I was having all sorts of thoughts and fighting with myself at some of the more nasty ones that popped up. Sam decided to leave after we had talked and laughed for about another hour. Jim wasn't home yet, and I was feeling buzzed from the beers I'd had. I walked him to the door, and there he thanked me for the invite. I told him I was happy that he had come. The next thing I knew, he leaned in and kissed me. It was a light, friendly type of kiss that should have touched my cheek, but I turned my head at the last moment, wondering what he was doing when his lips touched mine. Sparks. Lots of sparks. I was tingling all over deep inside, and fearful that Sam could see that I wanted him. I was able to hold myself together until he had left, that hot feeling of his lips having been on mine hanging with me until late that night. I knew he was married just as I was. I knew that what I was feeling for him at that instant was what a married woman like myself shouldn't be feeling for a man not her husband. Yet even though my mind was fighting the implications of what had just occurred, I found myself wanting more. After that, when we'd see each other at work, he'd always have a nice comment, telling me always how beautiful and attractive I was, and joking with me. More and more I began to want something more from our time. But I didn't know how to approach him with my feelings. I didn't want to hurt Jim. I just wanted to have a feeling that had slipped away from me at some point in my life. Sam, without possibly knowing it, had ignited that fire deep inside me. Later that summer, we had another of many barbecues, and once again, Jim was called away. This time, before we even got started with it, so I decided to cancel it. I managed to get in touch with everyone but Sam. For whatever reason, I blanked calling him about the canceled barbecue until he knocked on our door. Surprised at first, I realized that I had invited him in before mentioning that the barbecue had been canceled. Freudian of me, though I shuttled any guilt I was feeling off in the glow of Sam's jokes and easy banter. I also knew that his wife couldn't make this one either, since she had flown back to be with her mother who had an operation. He was only going to stay for a bit, and we were still in the doorway to our house. I took his hand and guided him in, hoping that he'd come. As he did, my heart started thumping. I could feel that fire deep inside bursting out, and I knew that if Sam did anything close to right, I'd be screwing him that night. Sam did his part without probably realizing just how worked up I was and how much I wanted him. By the time things calmed down, we were naked and on the bed, having just done it twice. I actually gave B-job to him, in the living room, where anyone, Jim included, could have walked in and caught me doing this. Laying on the bed naked with him, I felt my first twinge of guilt for having cheated on Jim. Sam must have felt something too, because he began to joke nervously. His jokes soon became several, and then we were both laughing, the guilt gone, washed away with the laughter. After that night, it got hotter and hotter, until we both realized that we had to cool our jets a bit, or we'd be caught. So we agreed to meeting on certain days. At first, it was once a month. Pretty soon it was once a week. Then, by the time Jim walked in and saw me, it had become 3 times a week in my home, and stolen moments here and there whenever we could get them. It had become a drug that I was addicted to. I think Sam was addicted to. We both knew that we loved our spouses. We both knew it was wrong, yet it was so deliciously dirty and exciting neither of us could stop it by that point. I never knew that Jim had caught me and Sam together until I caught him with my best friend. I should have known once I caught him and Shauna that something was up. Jim wasn't and isn't the type of man to fall or climb into with any woman that comes along. Right up until my sister told me why I had caught Jim and Shauna together, I figured that my cheating was not even suspected. When I had opened our bedroom door and see her on top of my husband, I had at first wondered who was in our bed screwing. Then I saw Jim, and the look in his eyes as he gazed met mine. A self-satisfied kind of smug look. My anger had been building. Then I was hit with the knowledge that Jim's look was one of ownership, like he knew something. Inside I was dying. My love, my husband, was in bed naked screwing my best friend. How dare him? How dare I? It hit me like an ice-cold bucket of water. This is what it felt like to know that your spouse was cheating on you. And I hurt. Oh, how I hurt. The implications of my affair now crashed down around me. I had to run. I had to get out. I had turned and left only because I knew that if I started yelling or worse, it would all come out, and at that moment, I wasn't able to face my own dirty secret. Once alone and thinking more clearly, I knew that Jim must have found me out, and my catching him with my best friend had been his payback. If I had hurt him half as much as I felt that night, I had destroyed us. My next move was to resist the divorce and try to fix things. Of course, Sam was out immediately. As I mentioned before, too little and far and away too late. Next, I tried to convince Jim to go to counseling, and I'd do anything he wanted. He just stared at me before walking away. I tried everything I could, but between my parents nagging at me and my sister working, or rather trying to work her magic on my husband, I suddenly realized that I had screwed up too much to fix this problem. Having seen Shauna together with Jim in bed, and the smiles on their faces when I walked in on them, I got angry. I know, I had no right to be angry, but still, Jim was my husband. Well, that was my messed up thinking at the time. Bother the fact that Jim's wife had been screwing another man in his bed for a long time. Twisted as I was and feeling so abandoned, though I had brought it all on myself, I tried to screw Jim financially. That didn't work for beans. Jim's lawyer was known as the best in the state for divorce cases, and the best lawyer I could afford was some guy that wore a cheap, smoky-smelling suit that had an air of mothballs lingering around too. Needless to say, I didn't fare too well. Jim did surprise me though. He relented a bit and gave up some money to me that I never thought I'd see. He didn't leave me destitute, though I deserve to be left that way. So, now I am here, in this dumpy apartment, with noisy neighbors and a not-too-safe street out front. My job was almost taken away from me, but Shauna, of all people, managed to save that for me. I wanted to hate her, but she had only acted what was natural for her, and though Jim was my husband, once she knew that I had more or less given him away like I had, her guilt was minimized. We don't talk or hang out, don't get me wrong, but she did go to bat for me and helped me to keep my job. I guess she felt a little bad for me in some ways. Maybe because my actions had reminded her of how shaky her life was too. Some would call her a free spirit, but most men I would overhear talking about her were more than likely thinking she was a bitch, which I guess was true. Of course, now I belong in that group now too. I am not fooling myself. If I hadn't been caught and then discovered my husband with my best friend, I would have still been seeing Sam. I am sure of that. Now, having been caught and having paid the price, the dear price of that hurt each day when I wake up alone, I am aware of one thing. I should have never ever gone there to begin with. I have no excuse. I am an adult woman and I should have been able to resist doing what I did. I can't even blame Sam because I feel that I was the one that initiated the whole mess. I still think of that day when I came home, about to shower up for my meeting with Sam, and found Jim in bed with Shauna. I couldn't believe the pain that engulfed my heart at seeing them together like that. I wanted to shout at Jim, kill Shauna, and scream at them both. Yet I suddenly realized that I had been doing this very same thing to Jim all along. Ashamed I had just left. I never knew at that point that Jim already knew about Sam and I. If I had, I might have acted differently and begged him to forgive me, as I would forgive him for his time with Shauna. Of course, that was not to be, and I highly doubt that would have worked anyway. Jim is nothing but resolute once he has decided on a course of action. I never thought about getting caught. I never thought about how much my cheating on my husband would hurt him. I never thought about what I was in danger of losing, until it was too late and I had lost it. This whole dark episode in my life has been life-changing and very educational. I know now what it feels like to have someone rip your heart out by its roots and toss it aside. I know what it's like to lose focus on what you dearly love and have to rebuild your life after the fact. During the divorce, I found out things about my husband that I had never known. Some guy he had been giving money to for our entire marriage, for instance. My lawyer had dug deep into his past and found out that Sam and I had been fortunate. Jim could have killed us both with his bare hands. That shocking bit of news was the most surprising thing about my husband I could have ever learned. All the years we were married, Jim had never even hinted that he had boxed or been a semi-pro boxer. I had never heard him tell of the fight where he'd almost killed a man. I'd never heard of him slipping money each month into that same man's bank account, and me none the wiser. As the divorce drug out, I remember discovering how much of a backbone my husband had too. What Sam and I had done together for our own selfish reasons came back to haunt us. Jim had arranged for everything he had on Sam and I to go to Sam's wife. His divorce was uglier than mine was. Another thing I discovered was that this was not Sam's first time at cheating on his wife either. He had been doing other women, even while he was with me. How his wife must have been hurt when he was found out. My guilt was not lessened in this mess though. I had always had that choice to say no, and I failed in my vows to say that. A simple no silently, to me for me was all it would have taken. Talking with Billy's parents had enlightened me in many ways to what kind of man I had married. His actions after that fight had been his penance of sorts, I am sure. But Billy was not a small man by any means. Billy's parents had nothing but good things to say about the man that had hurt their only son so badly. Billy himself had spoken well of Jim. He even refers to Jim as his best friend. I, Jim's wife of 7 years, had never even known. Other acts of kindness my husband had done for many others had come out in my lawyer's investigation. At one point, my lawyer had said that anyone as well respected and kind as my husband would be extremely hard to dig up dirt on. A statement that was to prove true. The only dirt on my husband was his sleeping with Shauna. That had been pre-planned by him, to show me what it felt like to have a spouse cheat on you. Be true to oneself. I have that at least. Now after the fact, that is, knowing what being cheated on really feels like, how it tears your heart out and stomps it into the ground. I know I'll never cheat on someone again. Ever. I only wish I'd known it before though. Oh, how I wish I had listened to that little voice in my head right after that very first kiss on my doorstep so long ago. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.